All of us here have 2 eyes, 2 ears, 1 nose, 1 mouth, and approximately the same sense organs all round. And therefore, because we have these organs the same, we all more or less agree as to what sort of a world we're in. Because we are in the majority about this. But there are some people who perceive the world differently from us. And the great problem that we have to decide is, do they have diseased sense organs, or do they have extraordinary sense organs? Are their organs worse than ours, or are they on the way to an improvement? We don't like to have to face this question, because wherever somebody perceives the world in a different way from us, we feel threatened. We may not be right. Remember in Kipling's story, in the second Jungle Book called Cars Hunting, the monkeys tribe, the Bandalog, used to get together, and every now and then they would all shout in unison, "We all say so, so it must be true." And so every great majority which has formed a consensus, a set of conventions commonly held about the nature of the universe, feels terribly threatened by somebody who suggests that it might be different. Is this person a genius or a madman? And we try to find out ways of testing it. And we say, by the fruits of his acts, we will know whether he's a genius or a madman. Because if his new way of seeing things destroys the kind of order which we agree is the right order, then he's a madman. But if his way of seeing things in the long run agrees with the kind of order which we think is order, then we'll say he's a genius. So you can't win against this. But there is this to be said: the crazy man has perceptions of a world which he gets lost in, and he can't relate to the world of the majority, of the ordinary people. He can't talk their language. He's got lost. Whereas the genius, who has a new kind of consciousness, can always keep in touch with ordinary everyday people and explain, or try to explain very clearly, his point of view in their language, so that he is, as it were, a bilingual person. A crazy man is simply a monolingual person. He can only talk one language, his own language, and if that doesn't happen to be your language and my language, then he's crazy. But the person, you see, I think we can decide this, who goes beyond craziness into something quite else, becomes bilingual. He can talk the language of convention, of ordinary everyday society, and the language of a world seen as beyond that or transcending that. So, this is what bothers us when we are confronted with new concepts and with revolutionary ideas of the nature of the world. We wonder whether the whole structure of sanity is being threatened or not, whether this is a crazy man uttering ideas, or whether it is some kind of a new evolution in the structure of thought, even perhaps in the structure of the nervous system. So the crazy idea which I wish to commend to you, which I will try to put into conventional language, assuming that all of you understand conventional language, is that of the reality of space. Let's go back to our problem here, where we have three balls moving in relation to each other, and look at it again from still another point of view. Let's suppose they all seem to go outwards from each other in this direction, uniformly. We can consider two arguments about this. The balls are all on their own, moving away from each other uniformly. Of course it must be that way. After all, it's common sense. The balls are the things. They're the solid. They're what's real. And they must be doing the moving. Only things that exist that are solid can do anything. But then there's another school of thought altogether that says, those things can't move. They're just balls. They're just solid things. They have no vitality. And furthermore, they are three separate ones. They have no common mind. How could they possibly arrange to move away from each other at a uniform speed? The thing that moves is the space between them. After all, we say the distance increases, and that's using the verb increases transitively, or rather, it's a verb that is being used to indicate an action, and it's the distance that does the action, apparently. When you say the distance increases, you use the noun distance in the same way as you say the man walks. So this school of thought says, so you see that what is really moving is the space. So you get the idea in astronomy that because all the nebulae, the galaxies, are apparently moving away from each other uniformly, this is put in the form of saying that it is space that is expanding. And these things float in space. Then it's terribly disconcerting, because when people wanted to feel, see, that space was something, and so we had ideas about the ether. And light would have to be transmitted through an ether in the same way that sound waves are transmitted through air. You can't, according to common sense, have the transmission of something through emptiness. There must be something in the emptiness to support this transmission. And so we invented ether. But as you will all know, the Michelson-Morley experiment showed that there is no ether. That you have to think about the propagation of light and about the properties of space, not in analogy with some fluid or liquid or gas which lies between all these things. You see, we keep wanting to invent ghosts, to invent a solid. We can't accept the idea of space. Now, air is a solid. Water is a solid. Ether is a pseudo-solid. It's something we had to invent to fill in this gap and say, no, although these solids are real good material solids, there must, if they are to be related to each other, be some kind of a tenuous, filmy, gaseous solid that joins all these things together. We've got to have that thing, we've got to have the strings attached, you see. We couldn't stand the idea that space, there's nothing but space, was important. So then you've got these two theories then, that the solids are moving, or that the space between them is moving. And both sides have got good arguments. I've tried to present them. But what both sides overlook is that they are each one-sided. That what is moving is neither the solid nor the space, but the solid space. There's a Zen story that two monks were arguing about a flag that was flapping in the wind. And one of them said, the wind is moving the flag. And the other said, the flag is moving the wind. And the sixth patriarch, Huineng, was asked about this, and he said, you're both wrong. The mind is moving. Because what is meant here by the word mind is the necessary interdependence of the concept space and the concept solid. That is of the nature of mind, that you can't have the one without the other. And so the mind used as a word to signify the interdependence of these two poles, one of which is solid and the other of which is space. And so, mind in this sense is the creator of the world. I'm not saying that you imagine the world, each one of you, out of your own private whimsy. What I'm saying is this, that the construction of the nervous system selects a world. You see, your senses are selective. There are certain vibrations which they receive and others that they don't. Then on top of your senses comes your noticing what your senses tell, because you don't notice all, and that again is another act of selection. And then on top of that is how you interpret what you notice, what patterns of sense you fit it into, what patterns of reason, what patterns of what you call good judgment. And that's still another level of selection. So constantly the world that we are aware of is a selection of our mind. But the way we have, in our culture, selected has always left out space and rejected the interval between things as something relatively insignificant. But now let me try and show you that it is the interval that matters immensely. Let us take another kind of space altogether. Not the space of distance between objects, nor even the space of distance in time between events. But let's take musical space. The common chord of the scale of C. Now, you have intervals between these tones. The notes C, E, and G are tones. But the intervals between them are something else. And you can hear in that 3 intervals the basis of the melody. But if you hear only the tones and you don't hear the intervals, you don't hear a melody. So here's the fascinating thing, that when you hear a melody and sound begins to make sense to you, what you are actually hearing to constitute melody is the space or interval between the tones. But it is how they are patterned, and there are no strings joining these points in the sky. In just the same way as there's no join between you see? But nevertheless, you hear that pattern. And that's what makes sense. So in the same way, if we increased enormously the magnification of a human hand, we would find a huge multitude or flock of molecules. And we'd look and look and look and look in and in and in, and we'd find those enormous spaces with no strings joining them. And yet when I did this, suddenly all those molecules would move together. Why? See, what has moved is not only the molecules, but the space. It's like birds in flight move together in the same way. They don't seem to need a leader who gives a signal and says, follow me and do as I show you. They seem to have one mind so that they all move together. Now let's translate this into another thing altogether, a problem which is quite fundamental to Far Eastern culture. And that is the question of birth and death. In popular thought, there is a prevalent philosophy of reincarnation, although it's interpreted in many, many different ways. According to some theories, there is in each one of us a soul, which is a permanent and enduring principle, and that incarnates itself in body after body after body, gradually progressing or regressing, and we hope eventually progressing to higher and higher levels of spiritual evolution. But in Buddhist philosophy, the existence of any such soul is denied. There is no permanent ego or permanent soul which moves from life to life. And yet the funny thing is that most Buddhists, for all that they don't believe in any transmigrating soul, they still believe in transmigration. And they talk about the karma which you have been working out from your many past lives, and the karma which you are now creating for your lives to come. And yet, how can they possibly say this? Because they don't believe in any soul which moves from one life to another, any entity that is, as it were, the bearer of this karma. So, to see how there might be a philosophy of transmigration, you've got to realize the importance of space, the importance of links or relationships between points that don't have any strings tying them together. And so when you look at the sky at night, you can think of the stars in certain groups of constellations. But that's not the only way you could figure them. You could figure the stars in other groups, and they would be just as satisfactory, provided we all agreed about them, how to figure them. And now we have a historian looking at those biographies, lying between these 2 points in time, and saying, by Jove, it really does seem, doesn't it, that where this life left off, this one seemed to begin. And so there really does seem to be a logical connection between these lives. And there also seems to be a logical connection between these. Although when it gets to this point, to this one here, it seems equally logical that this one go that way and this one go that way. Or it seems really here that it could have gone that way just as well as it went that way. Do you see what we're doing here? We're looking at human lives, and we're making the same kind of sense out of their continuity as we make in the patterns of the stars, by figuring out constellations. And that is the doctrine of reincarnation. Now you say, is that just projection? Is that just a way we have of figuring things out? Like when you look in a Rorschach plot, you make your own sense of it. And because you project yourself into it, that's what's so important to the psychologist, who interprets what you are. Because that was your projection into this plot. And as it were, the plot itself had nothing to do with it. But actually, the whole world is a Rorschach plot. Only we have forced each other to agree about how to interpret it. Because you see, when some abstract figure is drawn, see, what is it? What have I drawn? Well, what is it? What does that look like? Anybody? Nobody wants to be forceful about this? All right, if you're not going to be all right, you saw flames. That's why I was going to say the same thing. Now, you see, you and I agree, and we're going to lead this group. We're going to tell them it's all flames, you see? And so they're going to say, yeah, I see that after all, it's flames, isn't it? See? So, basically in this universe, when little brains and nerves and ticky things come into being inside the little pods called skulls, some of them say, all around here, this is the way it is. And it doesn't make any difference, you see, whether they succeed or whether they don't as a result of saying this. Because if, as a result of saying it's flames, they survive longer, then they say that was success because we survived longer. If, on the other hand, they didn't survive longer, they survived shorter, they would say it's success. Because the important thing is to survive a short time sweetly rather than a long time not so sweetly. Do you want to go off with a flash, or do you want to drool your life out at a steady glow? everything's a Rorschach plot in everyday life, only we've all agreed about it. And so it doesn't seem like a Rorschach plot, because certain strong human beings, people like Jesus Christ, Mohammed and the Buddha, and the man who made up the laws of Manu and Moses, and all these cats, have throughout the centuries impressed other human beings that this is the way it is. And the Lord God says so. So if they can invoke that authority, then this is the way it is. Here we are.
And we fought and we stopped and some broke.
Now, what we do, in other words, we convince ourselves who we are, that we are the same person sitting here now as came into this room 50 minutes ago. All this is interpreting a Rorschach plot in exactly the same way as one sees a continuity between one set or other of these stones in the river. And you can't say, you see, that that is something merely imaginary or merely arbitrary, which you project onto the external world, and that it's your own imagination and nothing more than that, because your own imagination is something in the external world. In other words, you couldn't have that kind of imagination, or the kind of nervous system that you have, unless you lived in this particular kind of universe. Your being an imaginative being, projecting all sorts of ideas onto the external world, is in its own turn something that is a function of the external world, something the external world is doing. So patterning, finding connections between points, is the whole operation of life. You can call it, there are two principles that correspond to space and to solid. One is called continuity and the other discontinuity. In one place we see a connection, in the other place we don't see a connection. I get your point. I see the connection between one thing you've said and another thing you've said, or between something I thought and something you thought. I don't see your point. I don't see any connection. So if I want you to see one, I have to be very ingenious to get you to see it. Then you recognize it. The Brahman is not personal. Brahman is, we would say, suprapersonal, not impersonal, because that is a negation, but I would say suprapersonal. Brahman is not he or she, has no sex. Brahman is not the creator of the world as something underneath and subject to Brahman, but the actor of the world, the player of all the parts. So that everyone is a mask, which is the meaning of the word person, in which the Brahman plays a role. And like an absorbed actor, the divine spirit gets so absorbed in playing the role as to become it, and to be bewitched. And this is all part of the game, into believing I am that role. When you were babies, you knew who you were. psychoanalysts refer to that as the oceanic feeling. They don't really like it, but they admit that it exists, where the baby cannot distinguish between the world and the way it acts upon the world. It's all one process, which is, of course, the way things are. But we learn very quickly because we're taught very quickly what is you and what is not you. What is voluntary, what is involuntary, because you can be punished for the voluntary but not for the involuntary. And so we unlearn what we knew in the beginning. And in the course of life, if we're fortunate, we discover again what we really are, that each one of us is what would be called in Arabic or Hebrew, a son of God. And the word son of means of the nature of, as when you call someone a son of a bitch. Or in Arabic you say Ebni Kelb, which means son of a dog, Ebni El Homar, son of a donkey. So, a son of Belial means an evil person. Son of God means a divine person. Human being who has realized union with God. Now my assumption, my opinion, is that Jesus of Nazareth was a human being, like Buddha, like Sri Ramakrishna, like Ramana Maharshi, etc., who early in life had a colossal experience of what we call cosmic consciousness. Now, you don't have to be any particular kind of religion to get this experience. It can hit anyone, anytime, like falling in love. There are obviously a number of you in this building who've had it, in greater or lesser degree. But it's found all over the world. And when it hits you, you know it. Sometimes it comes after long practice of meditations and spiritual discipline. Sometimes it comes for no reason that anybody can determine. We say it's the grace of God. That there comes this overwhelming conviction that you have mistaken your identity. That what you thought, what I thought was just old Alan Watts, who I know very well is just a big act and a show. But what I thought was in me was only completely superficial. That I am an expression of an eternal something or other. X. A name that can't be named, as the name of God was taboo among the Hebrews. I am. And that I suddenly understand why, exactly why everything is the way it is. It's perfectly clear. Furthermore, I feel no longer any boundary between what I do and what happens to me. I feel that everything that's going on is my doing, just as my breathing is. Is your breathing voluntary or involuntary? Do you do it or does it happen to you? So you can feel it both ways. But you feel everything like breathing. And it isn't as if you had become a puppet. There is no longer any separate you. There is just this great happening going on. And if you have the name in your background, you will say, this happening is God, or the will of God, or the doing of God. Or if you don't have that word in your background, you will say with the Chinese, it is the flowing of the Tao. Or if you're a Hindu, you will say it is the Maya of Brahman. The Maya means magical power, the creative illusion, the play. So you can very well understand how people to whom this happens feel genuinely inspired, because very often there goes along with it an extremely warm feeling, because you see the divine in everybody else's eyes. When Kabir, a great Hindu-Muslim mystic, was a very old man, he used to look around at people and say, "To whom shall I preach?" Because he saw the beloved in all eyes. But there is everybody, in his own peculiar way, playing out an essential part in this colossal cosmic drama. And it's so strange that one can even feel it in people you thoroughly dislike. So, let's suppose then that Jesus had such an experience. And they're of all ranges, as I said. This could be a very, very strong one indeed. And from the sayings of Jesus, especially in the Gospel of St. John, anybody who studied the psychology of religion can easily detect that that experience must have taken place, or something very like it. But, you see, Jesus has a limitation, that he doesn't know of any religion other than those of the immediate Near East. He might know something about Egyptian religion, a little bit maybe about Greek religion, but mostly about Hebrew. There is no evidence whatsoever that he knew anything about India or China. And people who think, Jesus was God, assume that he must have known because he would have been omniscient. No. St. Paul makes it perfectly clear in the epistle to the Philippians that Jesus renounced his divine powers so as to be man. Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who being in the form of God, thought not equality with God a thing to be hung on to, but humbled himself and made himself of no reputation, and was found in fashion as a man, and became obedient to death. Theologians call that kenosis, which means self-emptying. So, obviously, an omnipotent and omniscient man would not really be a man. So even if you take the very orthodox Catholic doctrine of the nature of Christ, that he was both true God and true man, you must say that for true God to be united with true man, true God has to make a voluntary renunciation, for the time being, of omniscience and omnipotence, and omnipresence for that matter. Now therefore, if Jesus were to come right out and say, "I am the Son of God," that's like saying I'm the boss's son, or I am the boss. And everybody immediately says that is blasphemy. That is subversion. That is trying to introduce democracy into the kingdom of heaven. That is, you are a usurper of the throne. No man has seen God. Now, Jesus, in his exoteric teaching, as recorded in the Synoptic Gospels, was pretty cagey about this. He didn't come right out there and say, "I and the Father are one." Instead, he identified himself with the Messiah described in the second part of the prophet Isaiah. The suffering servant who was despised and rejected of men. And this man is the non-political Messiah, in other words. It was convenient to make that identification, even though it would get him into trouble. But to his elect disciples, as recorded in St. John, he came right out and said, "Before Abraham was, I am." I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the living bread that comes down from heaven. I and the Father are one, and he who has seen me has seen the Father. And there can be no mistaking that language. So the Jews found out, and they put him to death, or had him put to death, for blasphemy. This is no cause for any special antagonism to the Jews. We would do exactly the same thing. It's always done. It happened to one of the great Sufi mystics in Persia who had the same experience. Now what happened? The apostles didn't quite get the point. They were awed by the miracles of Jesus. They worshipped him as people do worship gurus. And it's, you know, to what lengths that can go if you've been around guru land. And so the Christians said, okay, Jesus of Nazareth was the Son of God, but let it stop right there. Nobody else. So what happened was that Jesus was pedestalized. He was put in a position that was safely upstairs, so that his troublesome experience of cosmic consciousness would not come and cause other people to be a nuisance. And those who have had this experience and expressed it during those times when the church had political power were almost invariably persecuted. Gordiano Bruno was burnt at the stake. John Scotus Erigena was excommunicated. Meister Eckhart's theses were condemned, and so on and so on. A few mystics got away with it because they used cautious language. But you see what happens. If you pedestalize Jesus, you strangle the gospel at birth. And it has been the tradition in both the Catholic Church and in Protestantism to pass off what I will call an emasculated gospel. Gospel means good news. And I cannot for the life of me think what is the good news about the gospel as ordinarily handed down. Because look here. Here is the revelation of God in Christ, in Jesus. And we are supposed to follow his life and example without having the unique advantage of being the boss's son. Now, the tradition, both Catholic and Protestant fundamentalist, represents Jesus to us as a freak, born of a virgin, knowing he is the Son of God, having the power of miracles, knowing that basically it's impossible to kill him, that he's going to rise again in the end. And we are asked to take up our cross and follow him when we don't know that about ourselves at all. So what happens is this. We are delivered, therefore, a gospel which is in fact an impossible religion. It's impossible to follow the way of Christ. All right. Many a Christian has admitted it. I'm a miserable sinner. I fall far short of the example of Christ. But do you realize, the more you say that, the better you are. Because what happened was that Christianity institutionalized guilt as a virtue. You see, you can never come up to it. Never. And therefore, you will always be aware of your shortcomings. And so the more shortcomings you feel, the more, in other words, you are aware of the vast abyss between Christ and yourself. You will have your opportunity to speak in the question period, madam. So, you go to confession. And if you've got a nice, dear, understanding confessor, he won't get angry with you. He'll say, my child, you know you've sinned very grievously, but you must realize that the love of God and of our Lord is infinite, and that naturally you are forgiven. As a token of thanksgiving, say 3 Hail Marys. And you know you've committed a murder and robbed a bank and fornicated around and so on. And the priest is perfectly patient and quiet. Well, you feel awful. Think, I have done that. To the love of God, I have wounded Jesus, grieved the Holy Spirit, and so on. But you know in the back of your mind that you're going to do it all over again. You won't be able to help yourself. You'll try. But there's always a greater and greater sense of guilt. Now, the lady objected that I was putting up a straw man and knocking it down. This is the Christianity of most people. Now, there is a much more subtle Christianity of the theologians, the mystics, and the philosophers. But it's not what gets preached from the pulpit. What would the real gospel be? The real good news is not simply that Jesus of Nazareth was the Son of God, but that he was a powerful Son of God who came to open everybody's eyes to the fact that you are too. And this is perfectly plain. If you will go to the 10th chapter of St. John, verse 30, there is the passage where Jesus says, I and the Father are one. And there are some people who are not intimate disciples around, and they're horrified. And they immediately pick up stones to stone him. He says, many good works I have shown you from the Father, and for which of these do you stone me? And they said, for a good work we stone you not, but for blasphemy, because you being a man make yourself God. And he replied, isn't it written in your law, I have said you are gods? He's quoting the 82nd Psalm. If God called then those to whom he gave his word gods, and you can't deny the scriptures, how can you say I blaspheme? Because I said I am a son of God. Well, there's the whole thing in a nutshell. Of course, if you read the King James Bible that descended with the angel, you will see in italics in front of these words, Son of God, the Son of God, because I said I am the Son of God. And most people think that the italics are for emphasis. They're not. The italics indicate words interpolated by the translators. You will not find that in the Greek. The Greek says a Son of God. So it seems to me here perfectly plain that Jesus is got it in the back of his mind that this isn't something peculiar to himself. So when he says, I am the way, no man comes to the Father but by me, this I am, this me, is the divine in us, which in Hebrew would be called the Ruach Adonai. There's a great deal of made of this by the esoteric Jews, the Kabbalists and the Hasidim. The Ruach is the breath which God breathed into the nostrils of Adam. It is differing from the soul. The individual soul in Hebrew is called nephesh. And so we translate the Ruach into the Greek pneuma and the nephesh into psyche or psyche. And you ask a theologian what's the difference between the soul and the spirit, and he won't be able to tell you. But it's very clear in St. Paul's writings. So the point is that the Ruach is the divine in the creature, by virtue of which we are sons of, or of the nature of God. Manifestations of the divine. This discovery is the gospel. That is the good news. But this has been perpetually repressed throughout the history of Western religion, because all Western religions have taken the form of celestial monarchies. And therefore have discouraged democracy in the kingdom of heaven. Until, as a consequence of the teaching of the German and Flemish mystics in the 15th century, there began to be such movements as the Anabaptists, the Brothers of the Free Spirit, and the Levelers and the Quakers. A spiritual movement which came to this country and founded a republic. And not a monarchy. And how could you say that a republic is the best form of government if you think that the universe is a monarchy? Obviously, if God is top on a monarchy, monarchy is the best form of government. But you see, ever so many citizens of this republic think they ought to believe that the universe is a monarchy. And therefore they are always at odds with the republic. It is from principally white, racist Christians that we have the threat of fascism in this country. Because, you see, they have a religion which is militant, which is not the religion of Jesus, which was the realization of divine sonship, but the religion about Jesus, which pedestalizes him, and which says only this man, of all the sons of woman, was divine, and you had better recognize it. And so it speaks of itself as the church militant. the onward Christian soldiers marching us to war. Utterly exclusive. Convinced in advance of examining the doctrines of any other religion that is the top religion. And so it becomes a freak religion. Just as it has made a freak of Jesus, an unnatural man. It claims uniqueness. Yes, these other religions are very good. God has no doubt revealed himself through Buddha and Lao Tzu. But now, obviously, it is a matter of temperament. You can be loyal to Jesus, just as you're loyal to your own country. But you are not serving your country if you think that it's necessarily the best of all possible countries. That is doing a disservice to your country. It is refusing to be critical where criticism is proper. So of religion. Every religion should be self-critical. Otherwise, it soon degenerates into a self-righteous hypocrisy. If then we can see this, that Jesus speaks not from the situation of a historical deus ex machina, a kind of weird, extraordinary event, but he is a voice which joins with other voices that have said in every place and time, wake up, man, wake up, and realize who you are. Now, I don't think you see until churches get with that they're going to have very much relevance. You see, popular Protestantism and popular Catholicism will tell you nothing about mystical religion. The message of the preacher, 52 Sundays a year, is, dear people, be good. We've heard it ad nauseam. Or believe in this. He may occasionally give a sermon on what happens after death or the nature of God. But basically, the sermon is be good. But how? As St. Paul said, to will is present with me. But how to do that which is good I find not, for the good that I would that I do not, and the evil that I would not that I do. How are we going to be changed? Obviously, there cannot be a vitality of religion without vital religious experience. And that's something much more than emoting over singing onward Christian soldiers. But you see, what happens in our ecclesiastical goings-on is that we run a talking shop. We pray. We tell God what to do or give advice as if he didn't know. We read the scriptures. And remember, talking of the Bible, Jesus said, you search the scriptures daily, for in them you think you have life. St. Paul made some rather funny references about the spirit which giveth life and the letter which kills. I think the Bible ought to be ceremoniously and reverently burned every Easter. We need it no more because the Spirit is with us. It's a dangerous book, and to worship it is, of course, a far more dangerous idolatry than bowing down to images of wood and stone. Because nobody in his senses can confuse a wooden image with God, but you can very easily confuse a set of ideas with God. Because concepts are more rarefied and abstract. So with this endless talking in church, We can preach, but by and large preaching does nothing but excite a sense of anxiety and guilt. And you can't love out of that. No scolding, no rational demonstration of the right way to behave is going to inspire people with love. Something else must happen. Or we'll say, what are we going to do about it? Do about it. You have no faith? Be quiet. Even Quakers aren't quiet. They sit in a meeting and think. At least some of them do. But supposing we are really quiet, we don't think. Be absolutely silent through and through. You say, well, you'll just fall into a blank. Oh, ever tried? I feel then, you see, that it's enormously important that churches stop being talking shops. They become centers of contemplation. What is contemplation? Contemplum. It's what you do in the temple. You don't come to the temple to chatter. But to be still and know that I am God. And this is why, if the Christian religion, if the gospel of Christ is to mean anything at all, instead of just being one of the forgotten religions, along with Osiris and Mithra, we must see Christ as the great mystic. In the proper sense of the word mystic, not someone who has all sorts of magical powers and understands spirits and so on. A mystic, strictly speaking, is one who realizes union with God, by whatever name. This seems to me the crux and message of the gospel, summed up in the prayer of Jesus, which St. John records, as he speaks over his disciples, praying that they may be one, even as you, Father, and I are one, that they may be all one. All realize this divine sonship, or oneness, basic identity, with the eternal energy of the universe and the love that moves the sun and other stars.